The pregnancy test clattered to the floor, shattering the silence between them. Maria's hand trembled as she reached for it, but Floyd's designer shoe kicked it aside with cold precision. "Pack your things, Maria," he said, his voice like ice cutting through her dreams. "I want you out by tomorrow morning." Her breath caught in her throat, the candles she'd lit, the rose petals arranged in a perfect heart, the ribeye steaks warming in the oven. All of it mocked her now. After 3 years of marriage, after finally carrying his child, this was how it ended. "Floyd, please, I'm pregnant." He paused at the bedroom door, his expensive Italian suit still dripping rain onto their hardwood floors. When he turned back, his eyes held nothing but contempt. "Not my problem," he said flatly. "You're nothing to me, Maria. You always were nothing, and you always will be nothing." The door slammed. The wedding photo fell from the wall, glass exploding across the floor like her shattered heart. But Maria Saavedra would spend the next 10 years proving him catastrophically wrong. If you want to see how a woman called Nothing built $1 million empire and showed up to her ex's wedding with the twin sons he abandoned, looking absolutely magnificent, then subscribe right now. My mother said I'd never reach 500 subscribers. She said nobody would care about stories like Maria's. Help me prove her wrong. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the 500 who believe that broken women can become unstoppable. Because Maria's revenge, it wasn't violence, it was victory. And it's about to get very, very sweet. Subscribe now, you won't regret it. After 3 years of marriage and 2 years of trying, she was finally carrying Floyd's child. Her heart raced with pure joy as she imagined his reaction to the news she had planned with meticulous care. Floyd's favorite dinner warmed in the oven, ribeye steaks from the expensive butcher shop he preferred, paired with the 1995 Bordeaux they'd been saving since their honeymoon. Candles flickered on their dining room table, casting warm light over the penthouse apartment they'd shared for 2 years. Rose petals formed a heart shape around his place setting, and she'd even wrapped tiny baby shoes to present alongside the test. At 26, Maria still felt incredibly lucky to be married to Floyd Short. When they'd met at that charity auction 4 years ago, she'd been a community college student working as a caterer's assistant. He was the most successful man who'd ever noticed her. Harvard-educated, owner of a thriving real estate development company, and devastatingly handsome in his tailored suits. The sound of Floyd's key in the lock made her pulse quicken with anticipation. She quickly tucked the pregnancy test behind her back, wanting to savor the moment when she saw joy spread across his handsome face. "Floyd, honey," she called out, practically vibrating with excitement. "I have the most incredible news to share with you." But the man who walked through the door wasn't the loving husband she expected. Floyd's 6-foot frame filled the doorway, his expensive Italian suit soaked from the October rain. His dark eyes, usually warm when they looked at her, were now frigid as winter stones. "Pack your things, Maria," he said flatly, emotionless. "I want you out of here by tomorrow morning." The pregnancy test slipped from Mariah's numb fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor, with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden devastating silence. "What did you just say?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Floyd stepped over the fallen test without even glancing down, his movement sharp and deliberate as he loosened his silk tie, the burgundy one she'd given him for their 2nd anniversary. "You heard me perfectly well, Maria. This charade is over. I'm done pretending, and I'm definitely done with you." Maria's legs felt unsteady beneath her. The romantic dinner, the candles, the rose petals, everything seemed to mock her now. "Floyd, please. There's something important I need to tell you. Nothing you could possibly say matters anymore." He brushed past her toward their bedroom, his shoulder knocking against hers with deliberate coldness. "I found someone who actually deserves to be with a successful man like me. Someone who isn't—" He paused at the bedroom doorway, turning to look at her with undisguised disgust. "Someone who isn't beneath me." 4 months after Floyd left, Maria stood in front of the cracked mirror in her studio apartment's tiny bathroom, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. Dark circles ringed her once bright eyes, telling the story of too many sleepless nights spent worrying about bills, medical expenses, and an uncertain future. Her maternity clothes, thrift store finds, and hand-me-downs from her sister Elena hung loosely on her frame despite carrying a baby. She'd actually lost weight because food had become a luxury she couldn't always afford. The apartment was a universe away from the penthouse she'd shared with Floyd. Located in the most dangerous part of the city, sirens wailed through the night and gunshots occasionally echoed off the thin walls. It was all she could afford on her wages from 3 part-time jobs. The single room served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen. A hot plate sat on a card table that doubled as her dining area, and her bed was a mattress on the floor she'd bought secondhand for $40. At 6 months pregnant, Maria was working as many hours as her body could handle, cleaning offices from midnight to 6 a.m., waitressing at a diner during lunch hours, and doing alterations for a seamstress in the evenings. The work was backbreaking, but the combined income barely covered her $400 monthly rent and the cheapest groceries she could find. The crisis hit while Maria was scrubbing floors at the Meridian office complex. She was in the executive washroom on the 20th floor, alone, except for the sound of her own labored breathing echoing off the marble walls, when the first contraction struck her like lightning. "No," she whispered, panic rising in her chest as another contraction gripped her. "Please, not yet. It's too early." She was only 34 weeks pregnant. The babies weren't supposed to come for another month and a half. Elena called an ambulance. The ride to County General Hospital was a blur of sirens and pain. The emergency room was chaos, gunshot victims, overdoses, and families crying in languages Maria didn't recognize. It took Elena arguing with 3 different nurses before they finally took Maria back to a delivery room. 14 hours later, at 3:47 a.m. on a cold February morning, Diego Miguel Saavedra entered the world screaming at the top of his lungs, as if announcing his intention to fight for everything life had to offer. 2 minutes later, his brother Carlos Antonio followed more quietly, but Maria could see the same determination in his dark eyes. Maria held her sons for the first time, one in each arm, and felt something shift deep inside her chest. They were so small, Diego barely 5.2 pounds, Carlos just over 5, but they were fighters. "I'm sorry," she whispered to them as they slept in her arms. "I'm sorry I can't give you everything you deserve right now. But I promise you this, I will never give up." 5 years after the twins' birth, Maria wiped flour from her hands and glanced at the kitchen clock. 4:30 a.m., in the small backyard of their rented 2-bedroom house, Diego and Carlos slept peacefully, surrounded by the scent of fresh tamales, mole, and tres leches, cake that would feed the Martinez family reunion later today. The kitchen counter was covered with aluminum containers, 50 dozen tamales, 3 gallons of mole, 2 dozen enchilada casseroles, and 5 cakes. This single catering order would bring in $800, more than she used to make in a month during those desperate early days. What had started as pure survival had evolved into something unexpected. During the twins' first year, when Maria was working 3 jobs just to keep their tiny apartment, she'd begun cooking extra portions of her grandmother's recipes and selling them to co-workers. Her supervisor at the office cleaning company, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been the first to pay her $20 for a tray of homemade tamales. "Maria, these are better than my own mother's," Mrs. Rodriguez had said. "Can you make them for my daughter's quinceañera?" That quinceañera, 30 guests, $150 total payment, had been Maria's kitchen's first real catering job. Word spread through the Latino community faster than she'd expected. Within 6 months, she was getting calls every weekend. Within a year, she'd saved enough to quit 2 of her 3 jobs and focus on building what she'd started calling Maria's Kitchen. Now, at 28, Maria had clients booked 3 months in advance. She'd obtained her business license, built relationships with reliable suppliers, and even hired 2 part-time assistants for larger events. "Mama, it smells like heaven in here," Diego announced, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his hair standing at odd angles. At 5 years old, he already showed signs of natural leadership, always first to wake up, always checking on his quieter brother Carlos. Later that morning, after delivering the Martinez order, Maria drove to her appointment with Rosa Castillo, who wanted to hire her for what could be her biggest contract yet, a wedding for 200 guests with a budget of $5,000. As she parked her used Honda in the Castillo's circular driveway in Riverside Hills, Maria felt familiar nerves. These consultations with affluent clients still reminded her of the world she'd briefly inhabited with Floyd. But Maria was different now. She wore her best business suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd built something real with her own hands. Mrs. Castillo greeted her warmly, and they discussed menu options with professional ease. By the end of the consultation, Maria walked away with a signed contract that would change everything. 10 years after Floyd's abandonment, Maria Saavedra stood in her corner office overlooking the city's business district, reviewing the morning schedule on her tablet. Elegancia Events, the company that had grown from her kitchen table catering business, now occupied the entire 15th floor of the prestigious Wellington building. The brass nameplate on her mahogany desk read, Maria Saavedra, President and CEO. The view through her floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city where she'd once struggled to survive. At 36, Maria had transformed not just her circumstances, but herself. The uncertain young woman who once tried desperately to fit into Floyd's world was gone. In her place stood a confident businesswoman who belonged in any room she entered, not because someone else granted her access, but because she'd earned her place through talent, innovation, and relentless work. Mrs. Saavedra, her assistant Jennifer, appeared in the doorway. The Patterson family is here for their consultation. The Patterson consultation went smoothly. They wanted Elegancia Events to coordinate their son's wedding, a lavish affair with 300 guests, a budget of $150,000, and every detail customized to perfection. 5 years ago, such a contract would have seemed impossible. Now, it was Tuesday's second appointment. At 4:15, Maria left the office early to attend Diego and Carlos's awards ceremony at St. Mary's Academy. The private school had been the best investment she'd ever made. She arrived at the prestigious campus and was struck by how natural it felt to walk through marble hallways lined with portraits of distinguished alumni. The first time she'd brought the boys here for their entrance interview, she'd felt like an imposter. Now, as one of the school's major donors and a member of the parent advisory board, she belonged here as much as anyone. The ceremony began, and Maria watched with immense pride as both her sons were called to the stage. Diego was named student council president for the upcoming year, the youngest student ever elected to the position. At 10 years old, he possessed natural charisma that drew people to him, combined with an ethical compass Maria had worked hard to instill. Carlos received the Creative Arts Excellence Award for a short story he'd written about a single mother who built a business empire while raising twins. That evening, after celebrating at the boys' favorite restaurant, Maria tucked them into bed in their beautiful home in Riverside Hills. "Mom," Carlos said as she kissed his forehead, "can I ask you something that might be hard to answer? Do you ever think about our father?" Maria considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to. Now, when I think about him, I mostly feel curious." Floyd Short stood on the balcony of his downtown penthouse, surveying the city below with the satisfaction of a man who believed he owned everything within sight. At 38, he had methodically achieved every goal he'd set for himself: a real estate empire worth millions, political connections that opened doors throughout the state, and now the perfect woman to complete his carefully constructed image. But lately, in quiet moments like this, Floyd found his mind wandering to places he'd thought he'd permanently closed off. The silence of his perfect life had begun to feel hollow. "Darling," Stephanie Williams called from inside the apartment, her voice carrying that breathless quality that had initially charmed him. "The wedding planner is here. She wants to go over the final guest list." Floyd straightened his Italian silk tie and walked back into the living room where Stephanie was arranging herself elegantly on their white leather sofa. At 28, she embodied everything he'd convinced himself he wanted: blonde, beautiful, and from exactly the right kind of family. Mr. Short, the wedding planner, a severe woman named Ms. Chen, looked up from her tablet. "We have confirmations from 243 guests so far. The mayor's office called to confirm his attendance, and Senator Morrison's wife will be representing their family." Floyd nodded with satisfaction. This wedding would be the social event of the season: 500 guests at the Grand Belmont Hotel, dinner catered by the city's most exclusive restaurant, entertainment provided by a jazz quartet that usually performed for heads of state. "Oh, Floyd," Stephanie said suddenly, examining her perfectly manicured nails with casual attention. Didn't you mention wanting to invite that woman from your past? Your first wife? Floyd's jaw tightened at the reminder. Yes, Maria Saavedra. Have we sent her invitation yet? The truth was, Floyd had been thinking about Maria more often than he cared to admit. Not with longing or regret. He'd convinced himself he felt neither, but with nagging curiosity about what happened to her after he left. 10 years of complete silence. No attempts at contact. No requests for money. Nothing. I have her address here. Ms. Chin consulted her list. 412 Maple Street, apartment 3B. Shall I add her to the formal invitation list? Absolutely, Floyd said, his smile cold and calculating. Make sure she gets the full invitation package, the embossed stationery, the silk envelope, everything. I want her to understand exactly what kind of event this is. Floyd walked to the windows again, hands clasped behind his back. Let's call it closure, darling. Maria needs to see what real success looks like. The morning after receiving Floyd's invitation, Maria woke with a sense of purpose that felt almost electric. As she prepared breakfast for Diego and Carlos, her mind was already working through the logistics of what she'd privately begun calling Operation Vindication. Floyd's wedding was in exactly 3 weeks, enough time to orchestrate the perfect entrance, but not so much time that she could second-guess herself. "Mom, you seem different today," Diego observed, looking up from his cereal with sharp perception. Excited different. Did something big happen with Elegancia Events? Maria smiled at her intuitive son. Something like that, Miko. How would you and Carlos like to attend a very elegant, very important wedding with me? Carlos's eyes lit up with curiosity. What kind of wedding? Do we know the people getting married? It's a very formal affair. Black tie, 500 guests at the Grand Belmont Hotel. You need to wear tuxedos and be on your absolute best behavior around some very wealthy, powerful people. Maria knelt down to their level, recognizing that her sons deserved honesty. Boys, you remember how I've always told you that your father chose not to be part of our lives before you were born? Well, this wedding is his wedding. He's getting married, and he invited us to attend. Diego's expression sharpened with understanding beyond his years. He invited us, after all this time? Why? I think he wants to show us how successful he's become. He probably expects us to look impressed, or maybe even sad that we're not part of his life. But we're not sad, Carlos said matter-of-factly. We have a great life. Why would we be sad about missing out on someone who didn't want us? You're absolutely right, Maria replied. And that's exactly what I want him to see, that we're not sad, we're not struggling, and we don't need anything from him. That afternoon, Maria and Elena embarked on what Elena had dubbed Operation Transformation Phase 2. At Nordstrom, Maria met with Patricia, her personal shopper. I need something absolutely spectacular, Maria told Patricia. Black tie wedding guest, and I want to make an unforgettable impression. This is probably the most important entrance I'll ever make. 3 hours later, they'd found the ideal dress. A stunning midnight blue gown by Oscar de la Renta that hugged Maria's figure perfectly before flowing into an elegant train. Mija, you look like you should be on the red carpet, Elena breathed. That's exactly the look I want, Maria replied, studying herself in the three-way mirror. This wasn't just a dress, it was armor, confidence made visible. The black town car pulled up to the Grand Belmont Hotel at precisely 7:15 p.m., fashionably late as Maria had planned. Through the tinted windows, she could see elegantly dressed guests mingling on the rose garden terrace, champagne glasses catching the golden light of the setting sun. Are you ready? Boys, Maria asked, checking Diego and Carlos one final time. We're ready, Mom, Diego said with quiet confidence. Remember what we practiced, firm handshakes, eye contact, and pleased to meet you when introduced to adults. The driver opened their door, and Maria stepped out first. The midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown flowed around her like liquid silk, and she could feel the subtle shift in energy as nearby guests noticed her arrival. Diego and Carlos flanked her on either side, their matching tuxedos perfectly tailored, their bearing confident but respectful. Together, the three of them looked like what they were, a family of substance and success who had earned their place in any room. Mrs. Saavedra, the maitre d', Robert, greeted her with genuine warmth and recognition. What a pleasure to see you again. Your work on the Sinclair merger celebration was absolutely magnificent. As they walked through the hotel's opulent lobby toward the garden terrace, Maria caught glimpses of herself and the boys in the mirrored walls. They looked like they'd stepped out of the pages of a luxury lifestyle magazine. The moment they stepped onto the terrace, Maria felt the ripple effect that always accompanies a truly dramatic entrance. Conversations didn't stop abruptly, but there was a subtle shift in energy, a turning of heads and the kind of curious attention that successful, beautiful people naturally command. "My goodness," she heard a woman whisper to her companion. "Who is that stunning woman with those handsome boys? They look like they should be in a magazine." Maria accepted a champagne flute from a passing waiter and surveyed the crowd with practiced ease. She recognized several faces from her own professional and social circles. "Maria Saavedra," a familiar voice called out, and Maria turned to see Senator Morrison's wife approaching with obvious delight. "I had no idea you'd be here. You look absolutely radiant, my dear." More introductions followed in rapid succession. The president of the Chamber of Commerce, Judge Harrison, 3 prominent businessmen. Each interaction served to establish her presence and status among the wedding guests. From across the terrace, she caught sight of Floyd for the first time in 10 years. At 38, he was still undeniably handsome, but as Maria watched him, she felt absolutely nothing. No flutter of old attraction, no anger or bitterness. He was simply a stranger now. Floyd hadn't noticed her yet, but several people in his circle had begun glancing in her direction. Then Stephanie Williams appeared, whispering something to Floyd and gesturing discreetly toward Maria. Maria watched as Floyd's expression shifted from the casual attention to sharp focus. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed directly on her. First confusion, then recognition, then shock as he took in her elegant appearance. But it wasn't until his gaze shifted to Diego and Carlos that Maria saw true comprehension dawn in his eyes. The resemblance was unmistakable. Diego had Floyd's exact jawline. Carlos had his dark eyebrows and just elegant hands. There was no question. These were Floyd Short's children. Maria decided it was time to take control. With Diego and Carlos beside her, she began walking slowly across the terrace toward Floyd's group. Conversations parted before them like water. "Hello, Floyd," Maria said when they were close enough for normal conversation. Her voice was warm but controlled, carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Thank you for the kind invitation to your wedding. It's been enlightening to see how well some people have done for themselves." Floyd opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. "These are my sons," Maria continued smoothly. "Diego and Carlos. Boys, this is Mr. Short, the groom. We came to congratulate him." Both boys stepped forward with impeccable manners, offering polite handshakes. How old are they?" Floyd asked, his voice rough with shock. 10, Maria replied calmly. "They'll be 11 in February, twins, as you can see." The math was simple enough for everyone present to calculate instantly. Stephanie's eyes widened as she looked between Floyd and the boys. "Floyd," Stephanie said slowly, her voice rising with disbelief. "Are these—" "Yes," Maria answered for him, her voice carrying clearly. "These are Floyd's sons, the children he chose not to be part of their lives." The silence that followed was deafening. "Congratulations on your wedding," Maria said graciously. "I hope you'll both be very happy together." As she turned to walk away with Diego and Carlos, Maria heard Stephanie's voice rising behind them in what sounded like the beginning of a very public, very heated argument. The evening was just beginning, and already Floyd's perfect wedding was starting to unravel. Behind them, Stephanie's voice was rising with each word, sharp with confusion and growing outrage. "Floyd, what is she talking about? You have children? You told me you'd never been seriously involved with anyone before me." The whispered conversations that had started around Floyd's group were spreading through the crowd like wildfire, creating an undercurrent of excitement and scandal that transformed the wedding reception into something resembling a public tribunal. Maria guided the boys toward a quieter section of the terrace near the fountain, where they could observe without being in the direct center of attention. "Mom," Diego said quietly, "that man, Mr. Short, he looked like he'd seen a ghost when he saw us." "In a way he did, mijo," Maria replied, watching the drama unfold across the terrace. "Sometimes people are surprised by the consequences of their choices." Mrs. Morrison appeared at her elbow, her face flushed with excitement and barely contained indignation. "My dear, is it true? Are those boys Floyd Short's sons?" Maria nodded calmly. "Yes, they are." Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine shock. "But I had no idea. He'd been married before, and such handsome, well-mannered boys. They're clearly exceptional children." "How long were you married?" asked Dr. Valdez, who had appeared as if drawn by the magnetic pull of developing scandal. 3 years, Maria replied evenly. "We divorced when I was pregnant with the twins." A collective gasp rose from the growing circle of listeners. Dr. Valdez's professional composure cracked. "He left you when you were pregnant, with twins?" "Floyd made his position very clear," Maria said with measured calm. "He wasn't interested in being a father." Across the terrace, the confrontation was escalating rapidly. Stephanie's voice had risen to a pitch that was carrying clearly across the entire garden. "You abandoned your pregnant wife?" Stephanie's voice cracked with disbelief and growing hysteria. "Floyd, how could you not tell me something like this? How could you lie to me for 2 entire years?" "It's complicated." Floyd's voice carried across the crowd, sounding weak and defensive. "Complicated?" Stephanie's laugh was sharp and broken. "What's complicated about being a decent human being? What's complicated about taking care of your own children?" Senator Morrison pushed through the crowd. "Is this true, Floyd? Did you really abandon your pregnant wife and children?" "The situation was," Maria's voice cut through Floyd's attempted explanation, carrying clearly across the increasingly quiet crowd, "that you called me nothing and walked away from your pregnant wife." A visible shudder ran through the assembled guests. "You called her nothing?" Dr. Valdez examined Floyd like a particularly disgusting specimen. "A pregnant woman carrying your children, and you called her nothing?" Then Diego stepped forward with remarkable poise for a 10-year-old. "Mr. Short, my mother told us you didn't want children. She said you chose not to be part of our lives. We turned out fine without you," Carlos added quietly. "Mom made sure we had everything we needed. We don't need anything from you now." The crowd murmured its approval, and Maria could see tears in several women's eyes. Stephanie suddenly broke away from Floyd and walked directly over to Maria, tears streaming down her face. "I am so sorry," she said, taking Maria's hands in hers. "I'm sorry for what he did to you. I'm sorry I almost married such a monster without knowing what he was capable of." "You're not responsible for his choices," Maria replied gently. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stephanie announced, turning to address the crowd, "there will be no wedding tonight. I cannot and will not marry a man who could look at a pregnant woman carrying his children and call her nothing." The silence that followed was broken by a single clap from Judge Harrison. Then Dr. Hartwell joined in. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding Stephanie's decision. One by one, the most powerful people in the city lined up to publicly reject Floyd. "Don't contact my office about those zoning permits," Senator Morrison announced loudly. "I don't do business with men who abandon their children." "My medical practice will no longer use your properties for our charity events," Dr. Hartwell declared. "The mayor's office will be reviewing all city contracts with your company," Mayor Valdez announced. Floyd stood alone by the fountain, watching his entire life evaporate as the very people he'd hoped to impress rushed to embrace the family he'd thrown away. 3 days later, Floyd sat in his lawyer's office, staring at a stack of documents that represented the beginning of the end. His attorney, Marcus Webb, looked uncomfortable as he reviewed the papers. "The Morrison family has officially withdrawn their political endorsement from all your development projects," Marcus said without preamble. "The Riverside Heights project is dead in the water without their support. The city council won't approve the zoning changes." Floyd nodded numbly. The Riverside Heights development had been his flagship project, a $50 million luxury residential complex. "What about the other projects?" Marcus consulted his notes with grim efficiency. "The mayor's office has announced they're reviewing all existing contracts with Short Development, and Judge Harrison has already moved his family's legal work to Patterson and Associates. But that's not the worst part." Marcus leaned forward. 3 of your major investors called this morning. They're pulling out of the Jefferson Street project. They cited concerns about your personal character affecting the company's reputation. Floyd felt the room spinning. The Jefferson Street project was his company's largest undertaking, representing nearly 60% of his firm's projected revenue for the next 3 years. If Jefferson Street fails, you're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. The investors want their money back immediately, $8.2 million. And there's something else. Your ex-wife's divorce settlement is being reviewed by the state attorney general's office. Someone filed a complaint alleging that you deliberately hid assets during the divorce proceedings 10 years ago. Floyd's blood ran cold. The Patterson account, Marcus said. You had a significant trust fund from your grandmother that wasn't mentioned in the settlement. $200,000. If they can prove you deliberately concealed assets, Maria could be entitled to half of everything you own then, plus interest and penalties. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars. 2 months later, the bankruptcy proceedings were swift and merciless. Floyd sat in a small conference room in the county courthouse, signing papers that liquidated the last remnants of his business empire. The penthouse sold for $1.2 million, his court-appointed attorney said without emotion. After outstanding mortgages and liens, that leaves approximately $300,000. The cars have been repossessed. Your investment portfolio has been liquidated to pay creditors. The state attorney general's office reached a settlement with your ex-wife's representatives. You'll be paying $850,000 in back support and concealed assets plus legal fees. The payment plan extends over 5 years. After all debts and settlements are paid, you'll have approximately $50,000 to your name. No business assets, no real estate, no investments. You'll need to find employment. 6 months after the wedding, Floyd stood in the lobby of Henderson & Associates, a mid-tier real estate firm. He wore his last good suit and carried a resume that felt like a confession of failure. The interview was humbling. Thomas Henderson asked basic questions about residential development and commercial leasing, subjects Floyd had once known intimately. "I'll be honest with you, Floyd," Henderson said. "Your experience is impressive, but your reputation is challenging. This is a small firm. We can't afford to be associated with controversy." "I understand," Floyd said, hating how desperate he sounded. "But I'm willing to start over. I'll take any position you have available." Henderson studied him for a long moment. "There's a junior associate position open. Entry-level work, property inspections, document filing, client follow-up calls. The salary is $45,000 a year." Floyd nodded eagerly. "I'll take it. One condition. You never mention your connection to this firm in any public context. You're here to work quietly and rebuild your professional reputation through competence, not connections." 1 year after the wedding, Floyd lived in a studio apartment, taking the bus to work each morning. He spent his days conducting property inspections and filing documents. Honest, but mundane work. The hardest part wasn't the financial struggle. It was the knowledge that he'd brought all of this on himself through his own cruelty. One evening, riding the bus home, Floyd saw a magazine cover at a newsstand. Forbes featuring Maria Saavedra, "The Phoenix Rises, How Single Mothers Are Building America's Next Business Empires." He bought the magazine and read the article in his studio apartment that night. There was a photo of Maria with Diego and Carlos, all three dressed elegantly, smiling with genuine joy. Diego looked so much like Floyd it was almost painful, but the boy's eyes held warmth and kindness Floyd had never possessed. These were Floyd's sons, his children, the family he'd thrown away. And they didn't need him, they never did. Floyd Short had wanted to humiliate his ex-wife at his wedding. Instead, he had orchestrated the most complete and devastating destruction of his own life imaginable. The man who'd called Maria nothing had become nothing himself. 2 years after Floyd's wedding disaster, Maria Saavedra stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new executive suite, watching the morning sun illuminate the city skyline from the 30th floor of the Meridian Tower. The bronze nameplate on the reception desk now read, "Elegancia Events International, Maria Saavedra, founder and CEO." What had begun as survival cooking in a studio apartment had evolved into a luxury event planning empire with offices in 4 cities and clients across 3 countries. At 38, Maria embodied success in ways she'd never imagined possible during those desperate early years. But more than the material achievements, what filled her with the deepest satisfaction was watching Diego and Carlos flourish into remarkable young men. "Mrs. Saavedra," her executive assistant Catherine appeared. "The Forbes photographer is here for your cover shoot." and the reporter from Harvard Business Review wants to confirm your interview time for this afternoon. The Forbes cover story was titled, "The Phoenix Rises: How Single Mothers Are Building America's Next Business Empires." The Harvard Business Review interview was for a case study on crisis management and reputation building. Maria's handling of Floyd's wedding confrontation had become legendary in business schools. At 3:15, Maria left her office early to attend Diego and Carlos's debate tournament finals. At 12 years old, both twins had grown into exceptional young men. Diego had been elected student body president for the second consecutive year, the youngest student in St. Mary's Academy's history to hold the position twice. Carlos had won the state middle school creative writing championship and been accepted into Georgetown University's summer program for gifted young writers. When the results were announced, Diego's team won first place and Carlos's team took second. But what moved Maria most was watching the brothers congratulate each other with genuine joy. That evening, after celebrating, Maria tucked them into bed in their beautiful home in Riverside Hills. "Mom," Carlos said, "can I ask you something? Do you think we would be different people if our father had stayed?" "That's a profound question," Maria replied. "I think you might be very different. You might not have learned to value hard work and resilience the way you do now." Diego appeared in the doorway. "I think we're lucky he left, not because we don't want a father, but because we got to see how strong and amazing our mom is. We learned that you don't have to accept being treated badly just because someone is family," Diego continued. "We learned that real love means supporting each other's dreams, not tearing each other down." Carlos nodded. "And we learned that success means being proud of who you are, not needing to make other people feel small." "When did you two become so wise?" Maria asked, pulling both boys close. "We had a good teacher," Carlos said simply. As Maria prepared for bed, she smiled at the thought of tomorrow. Diego had a student government meeting. Carlos had creative writing club. She had a consultation with an international client for a charity gala. Life was full, purposeful, and completely her own. Floyd had tried to define her as nothing. His cruelty had forced her to discover that she was everything he'd been too blind to see, too foolish to value, and too weak to deserve. The woman Floyd had discarded no longer exists. In her place stands Maria Saavedra, successful entrepreneur, devoted mother, and living proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from building a life so meaningful and beautiful that their opinions become irrelevant. Justice wasn't about revenge. Justice was about becoming so completely and authentically yourself that the people who tried to diminish you fade into irrelevance while you rise into everything you were always meant to be. The broken woman is gone forever. In her place stands Maria Saavedra, and she is magnificent.